Hey, welcome to the channel. I wanted to do this video because I haven't really introduced myself in any way. This channel having been Innerways Forward and now Morgan Giddings. That's me. So why might you even care to stick around? Well, I'll talk a little bit about that before I dive into a little of my story, not all of it. There's so much. I'm going to share that in other videos. But why you might stick around, what this channel is really about, what I'm trying to create here, is a bridge. A bridge between disparate things. One of the most important of those two seemingly disparate things are science and spirit, or metaphysics, or consciousness, whatever word you can use for that. That idea that we are more than just these physical bodies living in this purely physical world. There's more. And trying to figure out how that impacts our lives, how we can connect with that, especially during this time. It's such a tough time for humanity in so many ways, especially for those of us in the United States. I mean, we're used to having it pretty good, and we're being taken down a notch or two on that thing, which is probably well deserved in a way. But it's a tough time in general because there's so much chaos, so much unpredictability, political, economic, just you name it, and things are topsy-turvy. And it seems like there are a lot of people who've come out of the woodwork who are just very intent on doing very negative stuff. I mean, seriously, like negative stuff to other people. And so it's a weird time. And I think this is so important because what I want to share over time here is my exploration of having been somebody who was a really mainstream scientist. I mean, I bought into the materialism, the science, the atheism, and going from there to a place where I really believe and have a model of the world that says this is a much larger world than what we can see with our eyes. And I'm not just talking about microscopic, I'm talking about that at a deeper level of reality. You could call it the quantum level. And by the way, I do have a physics degree, so I know a couple things about that. But at that quantum level, there's more going on. There's stuff that happens that affects us, that impacts us, that we can connect to, that we can use to improve our lives. And one of the things that I've seen, I mean, in terms of being a bridge, I've seen when, like, if let's say you're somebody who's curious about this idea of spirit or even ETs or UFOs or whatever, there's a lot of times in those communities, they've been pretty small. I don't want to be negative. Like, I follow many people more on the consciousness and spirit side. I follow many people, and there's a lot of good stuff, but there's often this sort of terminology and lingo that's used there that often comes from more religious terminology, like angels is an example. Angels is a word that I've always had a lot of resistance to because I grew up in a family that my father had moved away from a big church in our area where I grew up. And so we didn't do anything religious. And so when I hear terms like that, I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? An angel? That term sounds loaded. So it's kind of tough. And that's just one example. It's kind of tough if you're somebody who's brought up and haven't really been brought up using all of that terminology, and then you're curious, and then you try to get into and learn about it, and you're confronted with all these things like that term. It can be a tough road. That's been the tough road for me. And I think it's just the terminology. And one of my goals is to make this idea of spirit, of consciousness, more accessible and more understandable, especially for people who are academically trained, who are scientifically inclined, because, I was in the heart of the beast. What I mean by the heart of the beast is in the heart of mainstream science, with a lab that I ran with lots of funding. I had degrees in physics and computer science and bioinformatics, and ran a lab having to do with the Human Genome Project, among other things. Worked on cancer research. And the reason I left that, I was tenured, so I was like set for life in a sense. And I left that job because I didn't want to be part of that system anymore. It's not that I didn't like science. I liked the process of science, but what I saw happening there was that science had, in the mainstream, had been sort of mutated into a form that was almost religion-like. And I grew up around religion and had decided that's not for me. That sort of authoritarian control over my life, what I should do and what I shouldn't do according to some person who claims that that's the right way. So I was always averse to religion for that reason. And I had discovered that being a part of mainstream science is like being part of another religion. You have the high priests of science, and I was becoming one of those. I actually became one of those, and was growing my reputation, had lots of funding, and it just did not feel right. It did not feel true because there were topics that were acceptable to research, and there were topics that are completely forbidden, including things like, let's say you want to try to figure out, are there UFOs or ETs out there? Nope, there's no funding for that. And it's a subtle way that people are regulated within that system. It's not just, no, you can't study that. It's more a subtle kind of shame and peer pressure if you're studying something that's out of the box. And there's also funding pressure if you're studying something out of the box. In other words, you can't get the grant funding you need to do your science, to keep your lab open, to have a team to do your science. So anyway, there were a lot of pressures to follow a particular way, a particular model of reality. I remember at one point when I was still doing the science, I encountered this guy who was very much into consciousness and spirituality, who was talking about, like upgrading your DNA codes through spiritual practices. And I was just like freaked out about that, because that's so against the model that I was taught, and that as part of that priesthood of science that I had to hold, that I had to, promulgate. Now, I'm not saying that he was right, that his stuff is true, but what I am saying is that the science, the mainstream science I was part of, that machine, it just forbade even considering something like that. It made me uncomfortable and shameful to even consider, what if there is this interaction between consciousness and DNA, which actually, if you look at the deeper science, it's not altogether unusual or out of the box to think that. In fact, there has been some evidence that has accumulated since then that our thinking does affect part of our DNA. It's called the epigenetics. It's been a while since I've been talking that language. Epigenetics. So there are these epigenetic markers on our DNA. They're like these little on-off switches, you could think of them that way, that are in addition to the DNA. They're not the DNA itself, but they're these on-off switches that say, yes, this part should be turned on, this part of the DNA should be activated, and no, this part of the DNA shouldn't be activated. And there is actually real science that's emerged that says our mind can affect the epigenetics, at least. I think we'll find over time that our mind probably does interact with our actual DNA too. In any case, so and here's the other thing is, if you go online and have discussions with people who are outside of sort of this mainstream, then you'll find that there's a lot of sort of fear and paranoia about what does happen in mainstream science. There's a lot of misunderstanding and thinking that it's all controlled by, drug companies or other forces or things like that. I saw a video on the Tube of You. I saw that, and there was a person talking about how he believed that maybe, it was more of a maybe, it wasn't that he was for sure about this, maybe one of the super colliders had actually altered our reality and put us on a different timeline, and it was kind of a conspiracy theory kind of thing. And I've seen a lot of conspiracy theory about mainstream science too. I think there is, you could say, a conspiracy theory there, a conspiracy theory to keep people in line with what's, quote, acceptable and what's not acceptable. But I don't know that there's actually, maybe there are in certain corners, like little conspiracies to do things. There probably are. But I don't think it's quite as widespread as is popular. I mean, conspiracy theories are popular. And that's not to say that I don't think there are some negative forces out there manipulating some things. I do, and I'll get more into that in other videos. But here I just want to talk about this idea that because this science, mainstream science, has become a lot like a religion, and religions are religions, some are more controlling than others, that there's been this polarized situation where it's like there's science and then there's religion and mysticism, and they're like neither the twain shall meet. There's this huge gap between those two things of saying, no, you got to choose sort of one or the other. Now, granted, there are some people who are more popular, sort of esoteric science kind of people, who do work, interesting work, that are more at that conjunction between those two areas. And people like Dean Radin. Dean Radin is a great example of somebody who does that research at the interface. But they're not really considered mainstream. Like if you go into mainstream academic research, there are very few people, and the ones who do still try to form that bridge, it's not so good. It's not so good in the sense they're just not supported. They're not. It's hard for them to get traction and be taken seriously by their fellow scientists. And I think as a result of all of this, like, we are affected by what goes on in main science, even if we're not scientists or scientific at all. It has an effect, and it has had both positive and negative effects on all of us. I think the science has had some very positive effects in terms of developing technologies to help us progress in so many ways, and help us address diseases, many diseases, not all, and things like that. There have been many benefits for us in science, and I don't want to sound anti-science in that way. But there have also been some real downsides that science has not acknowledged. And one of those is this very limited viewpoint of the world that is, it's kind of a ruthless viewpoint that, we live in this kind of cold, hard universe of where things only evolve through competition, and that therefore we humans can only do things through competing for more and bigger and faster. And I think we're seeing in the chaos that's happening the fruits of that, what I would call wrong thinking, that has been supported by science in many ways. And it's time for something different. And this isn't going to be, I'm not here to just be talking about mainstream science by any means, or a lot of science. It's more talking about how we can form and have an alternative model of reality that admits that there is consciousness, there is spirit, there is metaphysical stuff going on that we can learn about to some extent through science, but we can also learn about it through our own inner subjective exploration. And that's important. because this is one thing also that mainstream science really doesn't like to admit or talk about, which is that the subjective experience of humans is important. And in a way, if you're a practicing scientist like I was, you're taught from the get-go in your scientific training to be objective. You've got to be objective and fact-oriented. And I like to rail against this so much because it's such a ridiculous point of view. And I know I'll get some pushback for that, but it's ridiculous in the sense that, quote, objective almost always means, quote, consensus. It doesn't actually mean that we know that our model is true. Take any model, pick a model. I was recently talking about the Big Bang theory. Okay, so the Big Bang is a model, a mental model of one way in which we think that this universe could have started. It's a model. It's a mental model. So when we have a model, we go out and accumulate data that supports that model or doesn't support that model. And what has happened in science about topics like, for example, how we came to be, is that one model, one worldview essentially, becomes the accepted worldview, and then suddenly, if you're in alignment with that worldview, you're being, quote, objective. If you're not in alignment with that model or that worldview, you are being, a laughingstock, a shamed person, a person who's outside the box. And it's true in all sorts of areas. There were a lot of studies by various people, including Rupert Sheldrake, and others on precognition, and that includes Dean Radin as well, on things like precognition, being able to anticipate a future event or get information from a future event and before it actually happens, and then act on that information. I've experienced that myself. And I think what science says is no. The model says no, that's not possible. And so instead of anybody considering that, it's just rejected outright. And if you look at the effect that has on our society, so many people who are educated, scientifically minded, who like facts over speculation, end up accepting these models because that's what the smart people, the scientists, the priesthood have said. This is the reality. Like the mind matter stuff doesn't exist, even though there's a whole body of research by the Princeton PEAR organization. They're defunct now. They operated for 20 years until the people who started it retired. But they did so many studies, so many publications with very high rigor and statistical significance that showed that there are mind-matter interactions. Very weak interactions. It's not like they showed anybody who could just take a thing like this and levitate it with their mind. No, it was not like that. It was very subtle. It's like if you have a pendulum swinging and then try to affect its swinging, you might affect it a tiny, tiny bit. But if you repeat the experiment over and over and over again, you ultimately can get a statistical significance that says, yes, there is some interaction between the mind and the matter happening. And it depends on who you are and so on. They tested men versus women and all of this stuff. And men and women had different levels of effect. So my point is that, again, was, even though it was housed at Princeton, the two people who were doing that work were kind of outsiders to the scientific community. They got constant pushback and ridicule and questioning, and people said, that can't be true. You must have done poor science, even though they were trying to meet a higher bar. So this is what happens, and we're at this point in humanity where we need that new model of reality, because things are turning kind of crazy out there. And if we just stick with the existing model of linear, straightforward, whatever, blah, blah, blah. We are missing so much of what is happening to humanity right now. And that's why I'm coming on here. It's kind of uncomfortable to talk about this stuff because I was so indoctrinated into that system that thou shalt not talk about spirit or consciousness in these kind of ways. And I'm here to say I'm done with that. I'm throwing that off and saying, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the meaning of angels, or let's talk about the fact that nowadays I can actually receive downloads, or you could call it channel information of all sorts about what's going on. And my intention is not here to just be another channeler. Like if you go into the more spiritual and consciousness side, there are many people who channel, like they'll go on and they'll literally, I'm channeling now. I'm not planning on doing that. I'm not saying I never will, but I'm not planning on doing that. I'm planning on presenting this more as an exploration, my own exploration, and maybe that will help you, because I've gone from this point of being very atheist and skeptical and materialistic. By materialistic, I don't mean like, focused on like buying fancy stuff. I mean materialist in the sense of thinking that the material world is the only world, that there's nothing behind or beyond that material world. I've made that shift into a very different model that says this material world is, in a sense, like a video game or a simulation for souls. That souls or consciousness, I like non-religious terminology better when I can use it. Consciousness exists at a layer that we don't see with our eyes or with our other five senses. We can't sense the consciousness, but that it exists at a layer of reality. And that layer is, interesting. The more I've dug into it, it's very interesting, very complex. It's not just a big soup of mixed stuff. It's actually independent, like units of consciousness that move around and interact and are intelligent and self-aware, at least some of it. And that some of those gatherings of consciousness, you could say, that come together and they come into a body. They join with this biological body, and we are those consciousness joined with this body having this human experience, almost like how humans in the bodies go play video games. I'm not saying it's quite as trivial as that, but that's like, it's important stuff to be talking about because it can give us perspectives on the chaos. So let me just give you a hint of how it might help and how it gives me more hope than I would have otherwise. And then I'll wrap this up, and so that we have time to go through some other aspects of my story, such as the two different models of the world, and the one that's really damaging and the one that I think is much more healthy. So that'll be a future video. But how this can help now is I follow a lot of the consciousness community, and there's this big talk of this idea of a split in reality that's happening. And it's so funny when I say that. I think of the rapture, and somebody who said to me recently, "Are you talking about the rapture?" And what I'll say to that is, I think that something like the rapture that a lot of people talked about and didn't happen, as far as I know, although, who knows? I try to be open-minded, that I think there are concepts for things that happen that sometimes get distorted, manipulated, and turn into kind of stories that are either meant, somebody's using to control other people, or stories that are meant to just give people like a really easy out for this hard life. Because I don't think in my model that consciousness comes in and joins with a body to be here and experience this life. I don't think any of us coming in as consciousness thought this was going to be a cakewalk, especially here on Earth. maybe in other realms, other realities. But here on Earth, it is not a cakewalk. It is a very challenging place to come into a body and exist. Even if you're in a so-called, first world country with lots of things, it has been tough and it has many challenges. So I think sometimes an idea like, hey, something's going to happen and we'll just all escape and it will just be so perfect and so easy. We'll just all go to heaven. All of us who are right versus all of those who are wrong. And there's like a judgment in there. Now, from what I've learned about consciousness and spirituality, there isn't that kind of judgment. And there isn't somebody else coming to rescue us. That instead, it works like this, that we raise our own consciousness, and through raised consciousness, we can reach out for more help, spiritual help, consciousness help, other consciousnesses that can help our consciousness and assist us in our journey with information and ideas and sometimes other nudges of support. But they aren't there to just say, whammo, zappo, blammo, we're rescuing you and sending you off to heaven. They aren't doing that, at least not in my experience. And that we are here with free will and to take responsibility for our own experience on this planet, in these bodies, using that free will, making choices. And those can be either negative choices that are more towards darkness and heaviness, or we can make those choices towards lightness and move more towards a lighter way of being. And so this idea of this split that I said that gives me some heart, and I'll go into more detail later, but there's been this discussion that at some point there's such a growing divide between those who are really very convinced that they want to pursue negative things, negative pursuits. Basically, you could call it pursuits that take from other people. They're pursuits that are exploitative or extractive. And it's a worldview that I'll talk about more, but it's a very extractive, exploitative worldview of I'm not here to contribute to the betterment of anybody else. I'm just here to take whatever I can get, and who cares if it all goes to hell, basically. I mean, maybe you care that it doesn't all go to hell just so you can have a better experience, but it is fundamentally sort of an exploitative view. So there's this huge divide that has developed even more recently between that exploitative viewpoint and one that is attempting to reach a higher state of consciousness that says, we are all in this together. We are humans having this interesting human experience, and we want this experience to be better. We want this world to be better. We want a more cooperative experience. We want a system, a reality that benefits all, not just the people who can go take as much as they can and extract as much as they can out of the financial system or whatever. We want to work together for the betterment of all. This is not to say, by the way, that I'm saying that we shouldn't have individual sovereignty. Remember, free will is important. So we don't have to be a mindless part of the Borg. That's not what people that I know are aspiring to, and it's not what I'm inspired or aspiring to either. Sovereignty is important, but unity is also important, and we can have a balance of both. And there's a growing movement on the planet of people who are envisioning and holding this, you could call energy or feeling, for this idea of creating a new reality. And through mechanisms that I just don't want to make this too long, so I won't go into here, but through mechanisms that I'll go into later, it seems that we are drawing that reality to us. Despite what we see on the surface, there are many things behind the scenes, many good signs that this reality is getting closer. But the point is, it's not compatible energetically with this other reality that says we have to be extractive, exploitative, which has been kind of the dominant paradigm, especially in places like the United States. So there's a big clash there. And we're seeing that clash happening. And again, what others have said and what I have received in my own downloads is that this is a literal time of separation. And you can see it, like if you're uncomfortable with the idea of some kind of bigger metaphysical like thing that actually, causes two different versions of Earth, like a fork in the simulation. Like if you're running a game, you can actually do what's called a code fork, where you fork off one set of code and do some different programming there, and then you have the original fork, and you can have quite different experiences for the people playing the games after doing a code fork. That's my understanding of what is happening. Not like all at once, not like overnight, but like gradual separation. But if you don't like that analogy, you could just take it as that those people who are choosing to get together in consciousness and more unity are more and more gravitating to that, and more connecting up and creating networks, and that those will form the networks, the social scene, social scenes, not social scene, the social connections. They will come together in places and say, for those of you who want to be extractive or exploitative, you can go somewhere else. Now, I think the problem with that, and it's taken me a while to come to believe this idea of an actual real split of some kind, is that the extractive point of view is one that it can dominate so easily. Like you kind of have to have big walls to keep it from affecting you, and it can affect the health of the planet. It can, people who are of that nature like things sometimes like weapons of mass destruction and stuff. Maybe I'm not supposed to say that here on social media, but they like those things. At least some of them do. And so it's kind of hard to separate yourself off from that and still have those, while those people are still in some sense in your reality, they can still affect you. And that's my understanding of why we are receiving help to literally have a fork in this simulation. So how does that affect you? Well, I think it's hard. I've been saying for a while to people who will listen that this chaos we're going through, it is a time that allows us to wake up and choose which kind of human do we want to be. Do we want to join the people who are attempting to be extractive and exploitative? Or do we want to join the people who are thinking, yeah, we'd like a better planet, more unity and more sovereignty, more ability to control our lives. We don't want to be part of this system of work anymore that is often so exploitative. I'm not saying there's no work in this vision of the future, but more meaningful work. And that we want to get together to build something better. And then there are the people who are just like, nope. And it's not just, I'm not saying that other group are all negative in some sense. There are many who may just be convinced that that's the only way that reality can be. They've just accepted the Kool-Aid, so to speak. And reality is that way, has to be that way. They're maybe cynical about the whole thing. And that it's the opportunity during this chaos for people to really see those two different ways of being human and choose, make a clear choice. And I think this is so important for our individual future and the mass future, because it would be really easy, I think, to get sucked into the negative version of this and say, that's a necessity. I have to do that. I have to do that to pay the bills, or I have to whatever. For me personally, I'm like, if I had to do that to pay the bills, I think I'll just exit here. I'll exit this simulation before I have to participate in some of that stuff. Not that I want to, but just like I'm not willing to do that. And I think there are a growing number of people who are not willing to play that game. And I think having this deeper understanding of what is going on can be a huge aid in making that choice in a more informed way of what's going on behind the scenes. Why might you want to choose the more positive route, even if you seem like this other thing is a necessity? And I'll just say here that this other route, there's been a lot of manipulation. And I said earlier, I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories, but the one conspiracy theory that I do believe in is there has been a lot of manipulation of us all to convince us of the inevitability of needing to be part of that exploitative, extractive system to survive. And I say that as somebody who bought into it, who really bought into that and thought, I never got like super exploitative, but just thinking that, well, like running a business and thinking the only thing that matters is my bottom line and employee happiness doesn't matter, or things like that. That's an example of an exploitative thing. It's a more mildly exploitative thing because employees can leave, but it is still exploitative. And I bought into that. So I understand that. And as I've evaluated why I bought into even the milder form of that, I am like, yeah, there's just messages everywhere about the inevitability of that route. And I'm here to say it's not inevitable, that we have an opportunity to build a much better future together, whether there's this split thing or not. I still have a lot of doubts whenever I'm hearing somebody saying that, or I'm getting a download about that. I'm like, this is crazy. This is like, really? Like, I was trained in physics. This seems impossible. But there's a lot we don't know. So I'm keeping an open mind. And even if I'm wrong about it, even if I'm wrong that there's some actual split, it can't hurt. It really can't hurt for a lot of us to understand a deeper level of what's going on and to come together in higher consciousness, in more unity, in more wanting to build a better world together that acknowledges who we really are and acknowledges that we're here to have an experience that's much better than what we've been having. So let's build that together. And that's what I'm here to talk about, and how we can make sense of all of that and all of the chaos with that as the sort of end goal. So if you stayed this long, awesome. Thank you for hanging out and listening. And of course, I would love it if you could subscribe, if you could hit the like button. Those things help increase the reach. I know you probably hear all the other creators out there saying the same thing. Please like and subscribe. And I know it becomes an old refrain, but really, especially for something that's a new channel, new-ish channel like this one, it's important to get that reach. So if you agree, if you think you're into this idea of a bigger consciousness, of something better, but you also want to ground that in practicality and scientific understanding, you are in the right place. And I've got a lot more for you, but this has gotten long. So I will wrap up there. Thank you for being here. I'll see you later.